At 23:40 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at McGuire Field, Mindoro, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 180 knots through the black skies north of the Philippine Islands. 26 years old, 43 combat missions, 4 confirmed kills. The Japanese had sent 12 bombers to destroy the American airfields that night. Smith knew the pattern. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. American engineers were building 2 airfields to support the Lingayen Gulf invasion. The Japanese understood what those airfields meant. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could cover the entire invasion force. The Japanese had to stop construction. They sent bombers every night, conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything that could carry explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro on December 26th, 3 days earlier. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in tents below. The pressure was suffocating. Every bomber that got through meant dead engineers, dead construction crews, delayed airfields, a delayed invasion, more American casualties at Lingayen Gulf. Smith's P-61 was different from anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Top speed, 366 miles per hour. But the real weapon wasn't the 4 20mm cannons mounted in the belly. It was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, watching a glowing screen that showed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Philip Porter was Smith's radar operator. He'd been tracking targets for 6 months. He knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The problem was simple. 1 P-61, 12 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, 11 others would slip through to bomb the airfields. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Smith shot down 3 or 4 bombers, the rest would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. The airfields would be damaged. The invasion schedule would slip. Smith had trained for this moment for 18 months. Night fighter training at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida, radar intercept procedures, night navigation, gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. No visual references, no horizon, just instruments and radar returns, and the hope that the target you were tracking wasn't friendly. The 418th had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea, flying P-70 Havocs at first, then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters weren't. Stable, forgiving, powerful. The radar actually worked. But radar couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were coming. His fuel would last maybe 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes engaging each target, he could only intercept 3 bombers before he had to return to base. 9 bombers would get through. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties. Maybe thousands if they hit the fuel dumps or ammunition storage. If you want to see how Smith hunted down 4 Japanese bombers in total darkness, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. He had 4 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. Smith had to make a choice, which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in one night was genius or suicide. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors. Heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet, range 4 miles. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness. No moon, no stars. Heavy clouds obscured everything. This was why the Japanese chose tonight. Complete darkness meant their bombers were invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose. The dish sent out microwave pulses at 180 degrees forward. When those pulses hit an aircraft, they bounced back. The radar operator's scope showed the return as a glowing blip. The scope had two displays. One showed azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose. The other showed elevation, above or below the aircraft. Porter watched both scopes simultaneously. He guided Smith toward the target using verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. The system worked because Porter was exceptional at his job. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope. A smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. When the target got close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot's scope was simpler than Porter's. Just one display showing range and relative position. But it was enough. Once Smith had the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M. The Americans called it Betty. 2,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kase engines. Maximum speed 270 miles per hour. Crew of 7. Bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had a critical weakness. No self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar. No way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards. Still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. The blip grew larger as the range decreased. 800 yards. 700. 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it. A dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible. Faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position. Slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The 420mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage. Fixed forward. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds. 800 rounds total. Enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close. Fire. Confirm the kill. Move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The 4 cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening even through the engine noise. 20mm high-explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft illuminated the clouds below. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57. 1 bomber down, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope, all heading toward the airfields, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 0014 on December 30th. Heading 180. Altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down. Or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most night fighter missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous. Even with radar, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night was nearly impossible. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since arriving in the Pacific Theater. 18 kills in 14 months. Smith already had 4 kills to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the war. But records didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range, 4 miles. 3 miles. 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile. Same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one. 6,000 feet instead of 8,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would turn into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it. But fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately. Then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down. 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both were at different altitudes. One at 9,000 feet. One at 4,000 feet. And they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly, but the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, 1 bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023. Porter locked onto the third contact. Range, 7 miles. Heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed, 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament. 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streaked past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks. Necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0029, 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing, or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target. Heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative. But this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. 1 chance, 1 burst. Then he had to return to base. Whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying, Smith fired at 0034. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact, but Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact, heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfields Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died. because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. The Americans called it Frank. A single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 miles per hour, 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons, one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel. Barely. At 0052, Smith spotted the runway lights. 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long. Crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land, unless something went wrong. At 00:55, something went wrong. The runway lights went out. All 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway. Altitude, 800 feet. Airspeed, 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees, or coral reefs, or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time, not enough to divert to another airfield. Taqlabad on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%, and the darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61's stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin, not much. But descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle, or construction areas, or coral reefs. At 00:58, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear under the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard. Collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 00:59. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 01:03, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. No damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining, enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 01:15. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frankfighter, all destroyed between 23:57 on December 29th and 00:46 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters, but Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro, single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 15:12, Porter detected a contact. Heading north. Altitude 12,000 feet. Range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frankfighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight. But Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61, times a Waston, continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, it was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art. The kill markings. The aircraft that hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes. All lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29th enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, Over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with radar. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.